26. I'm Jim Monaghan. I'll be chairing the event today. We're going to see a series of short films, and then we're going to introduce some firefighters from across the country who will be speaking to the films. And at the end, when that's done, we'll be open to questions or to any points you want to make as well at the end of that part. So I'm going to start off by the first film. We're going to see the first film here before we see our first speaker.
I've been a firefighter since 1995. He's one in one.
So that's the first. I say it's going to be a series of 4 films, but after that film, we're going to introduce our first speaker, who is, I'm sure you all know, if you don't, it's Matt Rack, is the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union. So, Matt.
Thanks very much, Jim. Thank you, and welcome everyone to this event. Obviously, we've had COP26, we've had all the surrounding events, the huge protests on Friday and Saturday, and as a union we wanted to participate in that discussion that has been inevitably prompted by COP26 and the issues that it raises. And we want also to hear the voices of people on the front line of that in many ways. So for us as a trade union, climate change is already an industrial issue. It's a worldwide challenge and a growing debate within the fire and rescue service across the world. If we think about just this past summer of 2021, I'll go through a number of examples. We saw floods, you may have recalled, in Germany, which left 185 dead, in Belgium, which left 41 people dead. We saw at the other extreme of extreme weather, wildfires in the United States, which are an annual event now and getting worse. This year in California, Idaho, Washington State, Oregon and Montana, but also up into Canada, British Columbia, Yukon, Manitoba and Ontario. In Italy saw both extremes of both huge floods and huge wildfires. You will recall that again, bushfires are being reported on an increasing level and increasing intensity in Australia, and we discussed this with our colleagues across the world. And I'll come on to the question of rich countries and poorer countries in a moment. Obviously, firefighters are generally unionised, so these are trade union colleagues of ours in other countries who we talked to about their experiences in tackling those extreme weather events. So just to give you one example of why this is so important, in 2013, there was a fire in Arizona, the Yarnell Hill fire, at which 19 firefighters died in a single incident. That's 19 trade union members, 19 workers who went to work and didn't come home. Almost every year now in the United States, there are firefighters who are dying in some of the wildfire events. And of course, the examples I've given are in the richer countries of the world where there is better infrastructure and there are public services like the Fire and Rescue Service. Those challenges are far worse and far more devastating in the global south. So to give another example, exactly the same year as that Yarnell Hill fire, a typhoon hit the Philippines that left 6,300 people lost their lives in the course of that. And we know that the impact of climate change is already having and is predicted to have a greater impact on the monsoon season, storms, and of course drought. And one report recently linked climate change to some 5 million deaths a year. So it's clearly a global issue. Coming to the UK, we're also seeing witnessing the growth in frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, not on the scale, in truth, of what we see in Australia or in Spain or Italy or in North America, but we are seeing an increase in the number of wildfires and their as protracted incidents and greater frequency and intensity, and also of floods. And just looking at the story of floods in the UK, I was a firefighter in London, but was elected to this post in 2005. We had floods in Cumbria in the year of 2005. And one thing that struck us straight away was that we had firefighters attending huge flood incidents wearing kit, PPE, that was designed for fighting fires. Totally inappropriate for going into floodwater. It becomes heavy. It's actually creates additional risks to people. So at the time, by and large, fire services did not have specialist water PPE, dry suits, and other equipment that is necessary. We didn't have boats, by and large. We've had incidents where firefighters have attended floods and have had to borrow boats off local residents to get around. So we've had a campaign since then with the different governments across the UK to make the case for investment in basic equipment such as dry suits, wading poles, boats, and other equipment. You look at, again, the history of floods in the United Kingdom, 2007. I visited Hull, for example, and I think it's worth noting, if no one has, if people have not ever visited a community that's been hit by a flood, this completely devastates entire communities. Obviously, people's homes, belongings, businesses are damaged. It affects people in terms of the repair of their home, whether and when they can move back into their home, insurance, and all these issues. So these are huge challenges for us politically in terms of developing policy of how we confront these issues. 2009, 2012, 2013, 2014, and virtually every year since, we have had one or more major incidents of flooding here in Scotland or elsewhere across the UK. And if you take the question of both floods and wildfires, I think one thing that, again, we would want to point out is how huge these incidents are and how protracted they are. When you think about a fire service response to a bin fire in Glasgow, that would generally, the Scottish members make correct me, generally attract a fire engine with a crew of 5 people to put that fire out. And it will take, I don't know, it might take an hour to do that. Think about a flooded community we have firefighters at those incidents for days and days and sometimes for weeks on end. Similarly for wildfires, we are sending firefighters between services, particularly in English fire and rescue services, people travelling up the length of England, again, to stay in hotel accommodation in order to fight the protracted moorland fires. So in terms of public services, that's quite an unusual demand to be placed on public service or public sector workers to leave your home for a couple of weeks, travel up the country to fight a moorland fire. I'll just give one example of some of the debate in England. It has to be said. I attended the Saddleworth Moor fire that was mentioned in the film there, which is on the border between Greater Manchester and Derbyshire. And we had fire crews from all across England, come up from Kent, London, Welsh services had sent people tackling that particular fire. And I attended a fire conference debate later that year, and a senior manager in the Greater Manchester Fire Service said, well, what we need to explain to the public, to communities, is that these incidents are on such a huge scale now that we simply can't tackle them, and people just need to accept that. I found that quite staggering, that one, the impact on climate change, and the fact that we would tell communities that actually you just have to lump it because, and I pointed out to that person that actually perhaps if they hadn't cut 1,000 jobs from the Greater Manchester Fire Service, we might be in a better position to tackle fires in Saddleworth Moor or anywhere else. So for us, I think just to close, Jim, I think for us there's a very practical case that we want to make to politicians and to communities about the need for investment, long-term thinking about what climate change is doing, the demands that it will place on firefighters and on fire and rescue services. Actually, we're interested in discussing what more firefighters can do to assist communities in the face of these challenges. That means equipment, PPE, training. It means collaboration with people across the world, learning lessons of what firefighters are doing in Australia and the techniques, for example, that need to be learned when you're tackling huge wildfire incidents. Above all else for us is about people, because my experience having, and I try to visit those incidents whenever I can, is that they are a huge drain on resources, taking people away from their normal prevention and response work to be attached to a particular incident for a very lengthy period of time. So we see this as the start of a discussion with politicians here in Scotland and across the UK, and look forward to people's questions and contributions later. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. I think it's quite important to hear those figures for people to realise that climate change is already costing lives, and it's firefighters that put their own lives at risk and helping us tackle these disasters. I think can we have the second film now?
It's a bit like the old thing when people say plant one acorn, one day it'll be an oak tree, and it's getting like that. And I had that bit of realisation actually, cycling in this morning, thinking, wow, where is this going? This is just amazing. One firefighter once said to me, what's the point of recycling one glass jar? It's like turning up to an earthquake with a dustpan and brush. But then another firefighter in that same room said, that, yeah, if we all turned up with a dustpan and brush, think of the difference we could make.
Our next speaker is Denise Christie, who's the Scottish Secretary.
Thanks, Jim. Mark touched earlier on in relation to the international issues round about firefighting and what's happening elsewhere within the UK. And I'm going to speak a little bit about what's happening here within Scotland. It's great we've got, you know, speakers from firefighters that's on the front line, that's working within the operational fire control rooms, working with areas that specialises in flooding incidents and wildfires as well. And I think for us as a movement, certainly a trade union movement, we've got a job to do to show the link between firefighting and the climate crisis. And I think firefighters have got a job to do to show what that link is within our communities as well. Mark touched earlier on about, you know, the days and the weeks sometimes firefighters are spent at incidents such as flooding and wildfires. And communities and citizens probably don't think, what has that got to do with them? But if you've got a fire station that's a mile down the road, and that fire engine is away to an incident for, you know, for a few hours or even a few days and a few weeks, that means that your area within your town or city won't have a fire response. And if you do have a fire in your own home, or you have a road traffic collision, etc., then it will take longer for another fire appliance, a further away fire station, to get there. So these extreme weather events that firefighters, our members, are responding to, not necessarily has an impact in relation to, you know, the flooding and wildfires that they're attending, but it also has an impact on the day-to-day work that firefighters do and firefighters go to. Now, we've got 356 fire stations here in Scotland, and we've campaigned really, really hard to make sure we keep 356 fire stations here in Scotland, because the footprint is really, really important, especially in your remote and your rural areas, because these are the areas that tend to get the wildfires, as we'll hear later on in some of the contributions. And a lot of these areas, these appliances are crewed by retained and volunteer firefighters. So these are firefighters who may be employed, you know, in the local factory, the local bakers, they may be self-employed, may work in the hairdressers, etc. And they've got a pager, they've got a beeper system. And those employers, their employers, make sure that they have got the time to let that individual away from their main work. But if these individuals are constantly away, days on end or weeks on end, then of course that's going to have an impact on that business. And it's going to be very, very difficult, which we completely understand, for those employers to say, well, wait a minute here, I did support you being a retained firefighter. However, you're responding, you know, more and more each day, each week, and that's having an impact on my business. So we maybe need to think twice about that. So there's a consequence, a direct consequence of flooding, wildfires, how that impacts on day-to-day communities, how that impacts on businesses, and how that impacts on the safety of the people of Scotland. Because if we have not got these fire stations in place, if we have not got as many firefighters now as we did 10 years ago, and if governments are asking us to do more, then of course that doesn't add up. The Scottish Government have just recently produced their Fire and Rescue Service framework. And we welcome a lot of the vision and the ambition within that framework. It talks about the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service need to be prepared to do more to respond to extreme weather events. We need to have more resources to respond to flooding. We need to have more resources to respond to wildfires. And we're very fortunate in Scotland that we have got a statutory duty to flooding, whereas in England they don't. So there is a political element to this. However, if you have that vision and you have that ambition, you must have the resources and the funding there to follow that up. You can't expect, public sector workers on the front line of this crisis, including firefighters, to go out there and do that work over and above the normal day-to-day duty and work that they do, but having less resources. And we've got 135 less firefighters today than we did last year in Scotland. We've got nearly 1,000 less firefighters today in Scotland than we did nearly 10 years ago. And that's something that, I think if governments are really serious about this crisis, it's not about what's happening in the next 5 or 10 years' time. Our members, firefighters, are responding now. They are on the front line responding to this climate crisis. So our plea here today is absolutely welcome the vision and the acknowledgement, particularly from the government in Scotland, about what firefighters can do and what they need to do more and resource the service, etc. However, our plea is please make sure that they're properly resourced and properly funded as well to carry on that work. Thanks very much.
Third film ready?
I've always been aware of climate change and environmental issues, but I never thought that I would have this first-hand experience. I've seen the people and the environments that have been affected by climate change, and it's happening on our doorstep. In 2018, a fire started on Saddleworth Moor near Manchester. It ended up spreading for miles. Not long after that, another fire broke out in Bolton on Winter Hill, and the same thing happened. The fire actually penetrated into the ground, peat was burning. So it's a really difficult fire to tackle. We were generally equipped with beaters, which were essentially a flat piece of rubber on the end of a stick. We knew really all that was going to stop the fire was rain coming. During that time, the road traffic collisions didn't stop, the house fires didn't stop, but so much of the fire service resources were taken up fighting the fires on the moors. The smoke that comes from wildfires is just as bad as any smoke that you can breathe in. If a fire is burning for a month, just going about your day-to-day life, you will be breathing in those toxic fumes. It's so frustrating to know what needs to be done and what our job is, and to not be able to do it. We need investment in the fire service so we're prepared for these incidents, and we need action on climate change to stop the situation getting any worse.
Our next speaker is Roddy McAllister. Roddy's a firefighter who worked in Johnson Fire Control for 45 years.
Yes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to represent Firefighter Control on behalf of my colleagues. We are a vital link between the public and the firefighting crews that respond to the emergencies and the demands of society that are placed upon us. We take these responsibilities very seriously, which is why, as my colleague Denise has illustrated, we must be properly funded, the appliances must be properly crewed for health and safety reasons, and over the years there's been an erosion of these standards. I can speak personally from experience. When I joined in 1976, we did incidents like flooding and all the rest of it. But year on year, these have been increasing. In this month's Firefighter, Denise has contributed an article, and she states at the turn of the year of 2016, and I was on duty at Christmas and New Year in 2016 in Johnson Fire Control. Since the inception of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, there were 8 controls throughout Scotland. When we became the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, There are now 3 which are located in Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Johnson. Our responsibility is to take information from oftentimes very distressed, agitated people in a very limited period of time to arm our fire crews with all the operational intelligence to respond accordingly to these incidents. So you can imagine, when you say you work in the fire service and you're a male, people automatically assume you're a firefighter. When you say you work in the control room, they say, do you work on the phones? When you go on holiday, you go to the airport. Is it somebody in the phones that directs you through the air corridors of Europe or America or whatever? That's the responsibility placed on myself and my colleagues to capture a life-threatening situation within the space of between 90 seconds, 9 times out of 10. If it takes any longer, then we are naturally concerned, but it takes as long as it takes to get the information. These incidents, like wildfires and flooding, drain the resources of the fire and rescue services because of the commitment they take from the operational availability. And whilst these are going on, business as usual happens. House fires, assisting other services, which can be anything. Unless you work in a fire control, you don't realise the remit of a fire and rescue service. People may live in the community, they may see the fire station across the road. They might not see it turn out very often, but they're not up at 4 in the morning on Christmas and New Year when these firefighters are shoveling up the wreckage of a road traffic collision and the wreckage of people's lives. So we take our responsibilities extremely seriously, which is why we must be properly funded, we must be properly crewed, and again, with the climate change, as I say, is not happening in the future. Climate change is happening now to today's fire and rescue service, and trying to reassure the public within that space of time. Try doing it when you're speaking to some hysterical caller with their children being threatened by flooding. Now, in the past couple of months, I retired from the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service after 45 years on the 31st of October. During the preceding months, on 2 occasions in the 1 month of July, you've probably seen it in the media, London as well as New York and China were being inundated by flooding. We were taking fire calls from London, so that shows you what the situation, which is a BT procedure. When the local fire control is being inundated with calls, they move to your neighbour. Such was the amount of calls we were getting that had gone up the country to that time. So I'm taking calls for Clapham, Bethnal Green, all of that, trying to reassure people. 2 of the callers that I took personally were 2 young women, the mothers of young babies, in basement flats, and water was up to their knees in one case, and their chest in the other. And I've got to give life-saving advice to that person to ensure that it's relayed to London Fire Brigade, as it was in this situation, to arm my colleagues in London with all the information that they need. So the pressure, as you can imagine, can be quite tense and all of that. But I'm a bit of a potted biography here. My connection with the fire service goes back over 60 years. Those of you who are old enough to remember in the annals of fire service history, the Cheapside Street fire. My eldest sister was a Cheapside Street widow at 25 years of age with 4 children ranging from 5 to 19 days old. So I know the responsibility, not only as a community, but to the fire brigade community, my colleagues and all that. We take this very seriously. And this, to myself and my colleagues here, this is not a job to us. This is a vocation which we take very seriously. And the commitment and the understanding of the public must realise how vital we are. We need to be resourced, we need to be properly crewed in order for us to perform the duties that are placed upon us. We're all part of the society. I know some former politicians say there's no such thing as society. There is society, we are society. This climate change is happening now, and you have to stand up and be counted and support your fire and rescue service. Thank you.
Thank you, audience. I think Is that second last film? Second from last film. Should be ready.
I work in a massively populated town, full of high-rise, very little woodland, but we're going out to wildfires across the county. And if it's taking me away from the city, there's not going to be those firefighters there to fight the fires when they happen in a high-rise building. In terms of a building, unless something goes wrong, I know how that building will behave and the fire will behave in a building, whereas there's so many variables in a wildfire in terms of weather, the sorts of trees, the topography of the ground, so if it's uphill, downhill. A couple of years ago, I went to America to learn how they deal with their wildfire. They're dealing with fires at the size of counties. We were driving for hours through blackened, burned woodlands. They've seen it increase and they just know it's going to keep happening. What really worries me is the number of firefighters that we've got or haven't got to deal with something of that scale. If they get much bigger or more remote for us, I think we'd really struggle.
Our next speaker is Will, Will's a firefighter in Peterhead, and he responds to wildfires.
Thanks, Jim. Good afternoon. Firstly, I'll introduce myself. My name's Will. I'm the Region 1 North Area Health and Safety Rep for the North. I work with a dual contract. I work, as Jim said, whole time at Peterhead, but in Aberdeenshire, and I also work retained in Lossiemouth and Murray. Give you a short presentation of the effects of climate change, specifically the ever-growing threat of wildfires from a frontline firefighter's perspective. I looked into the Scottish Fire and Rescue Services statistics, and we've seen a dramatic increase in outdoor fires, even just in the last year. In fact, there were 14,973 fires categorised as outdoors in 2019 to 2020. This figure rose by 9.2% by this year, giving a total of 16,351 outdoor fires. Whilst this is only a snapshot of all outdoor fires, this is a worrying trend. It's not a new thing. If we focus solely on grassland fires in the year 2020 to 2021, the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service responded to 5,027 grassland fires. If we look at the same category in 2012 to 2013, this number was only 3,474. This is a 44.7% increase in the number of grassland fires in the last 8 or 9 years. And this is not a coincidental trend. If we really drill down into this data, the most shocking increase was in June to August of both 2017 and 2018. In 2017, reported 624 wildfire incidents across the region, rising to a whopping 2,329 in 2018, almost a fourfold increase in the space of 1 year. Now, it is widely known that 2018 was a particularly hot summer, seeing widespread droughts, hosepipe bans, crop failures, and of course wildfires. But why are we seeing these extremes of weather, and how is climate change causing this? There's several things we should consider. If you take a standard bell curve of weather in a given year, and you have a small region at either end where you have the extremes of weather, extreme cold being on the left and extreme heat being on the right, with your average normal temperatures being under the main part of the bell curve in the middle. As climate change causes a global increase in temperature, the bell curve shifts to the right. So whatever your threshold of extreme hot weather is, it's a fixed point regardless where that bell curve sits. So with the shift to the left, you now have more incidents that now fall into these days that are extremely hot. Put simply, a global shift to the right, or to increase the temperature results in more days of hot weather in extreme situations, a period of time. And this has been happening year upon year. And this region we class as extreme heat is increasing in size, seeing a higher number of extreme weather events, and more importantly, longer duration of these events. As these extreme weather events occur, they come with a multitude of problems that cause significant risk to our firefighters on the front line. As an increasing global persistence of droughts, huge reduction in ground moisture, and bodies of water being severely depleted, this poses significant issues when battling with wildfires. Even when we manage to scrape together enough water to extinguish these wildfires, with a reduction in ground moisture, the heat from the fire quickly gets deep-seated into the ground, and reignition is a very real concern, to every incident commander attending a wildfire incident. Additionally, with the lack of suitable water sources in remote locations, supply of water becomes the biggest determining factor in tactics employed by our incident commanders on the ground. Do we have enough water to fully extinguish and damp down this fire? What happens if we run out of water before we extinguish the fire? Which way will it spread? And of course, the question on every incident commander's mind, are my firefighters safe? Should that fire spread towards them and they run out of water? This also highlights one of the biggest concerns with the increase in temperature extreme. With longer lasting heat, the moisture is not only drawn out of the ground, but out of the plants that are on the surface, resulting in extremely dry tinder, providing a huge excess of easily combustible fuel. The smallest spark, a flash of lightning, or even a careless disposal of a cigarette can rapidly lead to a fast-spreading, uncontrollable fire. You see it at every single wildfire incident. Fire travel is a real concern. Our safety is entirely in the hands of our commanders tracking wind direction and fire spread to make sure we can attempt to get that wildfire under control. In both my roles in Aberdeenshire and in Murray, I've seen the devastating effects of wildfires and experienced the risk for us as firefighters at these incidents. Most recently, in July of this year, I attended an incident at Toms Hill in Murray. I was called out as part of an initial 6-pump attendance to a wildfire in the early stages in a wooded area adjacent to a crop field. Crews were quickly dispatched to 2 sides of the fire, fighting from the front and from the back. However, even during the first 10 minutes of that incident, changing wind direction immediately became an issue. Firefighters attempted to fight the fire were suddenly encountering oncoming winds blowing smoke directly into their line of attack. This became so dangerous we had to withdraw the crews for an area of safety and commit crews in breathing apparatus to be committed to that risk area. Of course, as with all wildfire incidents, availability of water was also a significant concern, but this was compounded by the time constraints of crews operating in BA. At the point that we'd all but run out of water, with this increase in wind, fires rapidly spreading through the dry woodland and posed a real risk to overcoming the positions of the firefighters and possibly even the position of fire appliances. As more resources arrived, we had to fall back in the sector I was in to a safer point of attack, while we commenced firefighting activities to the side to prevent lateral spread of the fire. At its peak, we had 8 or 9 pumping appliances with around 40 firefighters, 2 water carriers relaying water to the top of the hill to give a gravity-fed supply to the pumps, and a number of senior officers monitoring conditions and controlling activities on the ground. This incident went on for about 3 days, getting all the deep-seated areas dammed down, and over a kilometre square of woodland was destroyed, including an isolated area of 50 by 50 metres of gorse bushes. Whilst this is devastating, there are a huge number of risks here for firefighters at these incidents. And there's also one commonly overlooked issue beyond the scope of wildfire incidents. Wildfire incidents do require a large number of resources, and at Toms Hill, we had said at its peak had 8 or 9 pumping appliances were on scene. Toms Hill is relatively central to the middle of Murray area. And in Murray, we have 13 retained appliances, so they're ones on pages, 1 whole-time pumping appliance, and a water carrier. And assuming that's all those pumps are available at any given time. Once you remove 60 to 70% of the resources from one area to tackle an incident like this, all other fires become a greater risk as well. Domestic fires require 2 or ideally 3 fire appliances. Whilst the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service control staff did their best to reorganise resources across the region, realistically you could wait 20 to 40 minutes for a second appliance to arrive if other incidents are going on like this. Sometimes you won't even get a 3rd appliance. This leaves the officer in charge with an impossible choice. Do I commit a BA crew into a domestic premise in the hope that we can extinguish the fire, rescuing casualties, in the full knowledge that support is too far away if anything goes wrong? Or do you stand there in full view of the public, the media, the family of the affected property, and do nothing to your supporters in the area? Moral obligation sometimes results in firefighters being committed to that incident with little or no support if anything were to go wrong, which is an unacceptable huge risk to the safety of our frontline staff. This is a hugely overlooked concern when considering wildfires. What happens if something in the same region happens in the several days that these incidents go on for? It also has to be mentioned that firefighter crews can't work 24/7 in incidents like this. The work is hard, crew rotation and relief crews are always necessary. If you already have depleted resources in an area, then you're pulling resources in from further and further away, reducing cover in their own area and making resources even more thinly spread across the whole area to cover other fire calls. Only by changing attitudes to climate change and making real improvements can the safety of our firefighter be maintained. I want to leave you with one last example of the harsh reality of the effects of climate change and just how bad wildfires can get. In April 2019, we saw the true power and relentlessness of wildfire in Warwickshire. Paul's Hill Wind Farm in Knockandu is a huge area of renewable energy production and well known in the area. There's 28 wind generators stand proud at the top of the hills around the site, and it's accessible only by a small road of varying condition. After an unusually dry couple of months, fire broke out on the hillside. 15 fire appliances, 80 firefighters, and even 2 helicopters were needed to attack the fire that was rapidly and aggressively annihilating the hillside. The fire raged on for days. It could be seen for many miles in all directions. By the time the fire was under control, 20 square miles of grassland and countless native plants and habitats had been destroyed. The BBC reported the fire as one of the largest seen in the UK for years. And being at this incident, it was a bit like a scene from an apocalyptic endgame film. Limited water supplies, multiple seats of fire, and at times felt our actions were frivolous. Wildfires should never be underestimated, and over the last few years have noticeably become more frequent, much longer lasting, and so much more dangerous to us as firefighters. If we can encourage governments to take climate change seriously and work globally to reduce the damage we're causing, and maybe even repair some of it, then incidents like this could be significantly reduced and the risk to our firefighters be reduced. There is no quick fix, but commitment at governmental level to make real change might just give us a fighting chance. Thank you.
Again, just highlight that this is something that's happening now, which I think sometimes people do forget. It's not something that's coming in the future. The Wills statistics here are just quite frightening how much it's increased just in Scotland alone. So can we have the last film now, please?
We've always had a degree of flooding in the area I work in, but the increase now and the severity and the times of year as well are quite different. Where we normally expect flooding coming into winter time, we're now seeing it earlier in the year, not too far down the road from where we stand now. We've actually had to call in search and rescue helicopters in order to take people from their houses that have become completely stranded. I was actually mobilised to a lightning strike that I set a roof on fire some distance from my base station. When I was around the corner, my wife was phoning me to say, our house is just about to flood. I need you to come home and do something. She was obviously panicked, and I had to panic my wife and say, we're just going to have to deal with whatever flood damage there is in the morning, because I'm going to save someone from a house fire. And it was that terrible moral pressure of my family over my dream. Those incidents are becoming so frequent, and the risks so frequent that we're just getting pulled in every direction. That evening, there was hundreds of calls to our fire controls, to the extent where they were overwhelmed and we were diverting calls to Northern Ireland. Like all public sector workers, we're facing cuts. We've got to recognise that this is happening now, this is real. We need that funding for firefighters to respond to these incidents. We need to recognise that the accumulation of wealth into smaller and smaller numbers of people's hands is not doing us any favours. We need investment into jobs, infrastructure. We need to decarbonise our economy. There needs to be social change and social justice to bring climate justice.
Is Colin Brown. Colin's a firefighter in Perth, and he responds to the flooding.
Thanks. Yeah, some of the incidents that are referenced in the short film there, it just can't be underestimated the impact this has. You know, firefighters attending a house fire, you're in real extremes of temperature. House fires can get up to 1,000 degrees quite easily, and then having to go straight from that to a flooding incident. And that's the reality. You are going from one job to the next under these circumstances. So going from 1,000 degree temperature after a lightning strike takes the roof off a house, to then go into flood water that's taking your body temperature right down, operating in temperatures round about 1-2 degrees for protracted periods of time. The film contained footage actually shot by firefighters, and one of the scenes there has Really rapid flowing water down an area that's called Craigie Hill. It's on a hill, and that volume of water that fell in the beginning of August 2020, that volume of water would take a firefighter off the feet. But we are committing our crews, our members, to those incidents, having to rescue family members, having to go in and make sure the electric's off. That night alone saw firefighters respond to a hospital in Edinburgh and have to search the underground car park that was flooded to ensure that every vehicle within that car park was empty and there was no one trapped in there. That is massively labour intensive. That requires such a significant volume of firefighters with specialist equipment and specialist training and the understanding of how to search these vehicles safely and where to look and where to check. As that storm came down the east coast of Scotland, it wiped out a caravan park and caused landslides that put that whole caravan park at risk. Our firefighters, our members were committed to that scene to search every single one of these caravans, working in some of the most extreme weather conditions that I've witnessed in my 14 plus years as a firefighter. As the storm moved further down, we got more lightning, more hail, more rain, significant volume of calls to the extent that the control room in Edinburgh, that Roddy referenced earlier, the infrastructure collapsed around it. They could not cope with the volume of calls that were coming in. The whole communication system between the fire appliances out on the road, out attending these hundreds of calls, and the control room, that is our primary source of information, and the first port of call for firefighter safety, the whole thing collapsed. It shut down for nearly an hour. That meant members of the public phoning for a fire service response, phoning for an appliance to come and rescue them in their hour of need. We're getting diverted to Northern Ireland for calls. There were hundreds of calls stacked that night. That's people phoning up. I need the fire service at my property now. My family's at risk. My house is at risk. Please come and help me. Please hold. We'll be ready as soon as we can. And that pressure that's put on our control firefighters, that's put on firefighters out on the appliances, is unbelievable. And like I referenced in the film, we're getting mobilised at a house fire where every single second counts to try and save somebody's life, to try and save their property, their entire livelihood at times, and reaching points where we just cannot pass with a fire appliance, where roads are washed out in front of us, where vehicles are already stuck, and having to look for diversions. In one instance that night, it was a 2-hour diversion to attend a house fire that we looked to be at within 8 minutes normally. And those decisions for firefighters are just overwhelming because we know we're going to start seeing deaths as a result of this. We're going to start losing people at incidents where we're there to respond to, we're there to help people at them, and we just can't because we just don't have the infrastructure to cope with the volume of water that's falling in sometimes and the flooding that's there sometimes. We need that investment. But most of all, you know, we're sitting here, the fortnight COP, and the businesses and the world leaders making decisions whilst we're shut out. The voices of the people that are actually dealing with this right now are shut out. They need to start listening to people that are actually on the front line, seeing the world burn, seeing the world weep, and us going out to pick up the pieces. So we absolutely need to campaign on this. We need to get the funding, we need to get the resources right across the UK. And as my colleagues have said already, the UK hasn't really seen the impacts of climate change yet, not like the global south. But it's coming, and maybe then people will wake up and realise that this is not something that's down the line. This isn't something that's about melting ice caps. This is something about right now, right here, today. The beginning of the COP, Dumfries and Galloway was underwater. Our firefighters were there, rescuing people, doing exactly what firefighters do, doing what we take pride in doing. But we need the resources to continue to do that, and we need the resources to do it to a much greater extent as climate change affects us all. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. So we've got a chance now if anybody wants to raise any points or ask any questions to any of the panel, either the panel in general or specific. If there is anyone want to ask anything? Neil?
Yeah. A couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago probably, in my community, we've got quite a lot of forestry around. There's a major forest fire there. I think it took 4 days to sort that out overall. the support for the community was overwhelming. Firefighters were getting drinks taken to nice lollies, food and all the rest of it. But I was interested to hear what you were saying about that kind of the way it penetrates through into the underground and continues to burn. How do you tackle that? Because this was like pine forest on top of peat, which I'm thinking probably is actually on top of peat, on top of coal. I mean, just that petrol, you might as well. But it's like that combination must be almost impossible to try.
Yeah, basically, that sort of situation is quite common, and the simple solution is lots and lots of water. It's the only thing we actually have to tackle that. And when you are in a remote area or somewhere that you don't have lots of water supply, you're sending water carriers that carry about 5,000 litres of water, and you're sending fire appliances to nearby streams, rivers, hydrants, if possible, just bringing loads and loads of water. And it takes a long time because you're in these difficult places. Woodlands don't tend to have a lot of roads leading to them. And you are running long lengths of hose and just hoping you can get water there quick enough. And it is something we do quite regularly, do water relay, and it takes a long time. That's why it takes 4 or 5 days. It just isn't the water supplies there. And because it's, as we're saying, the increasing global temperature, that dryness that's happening in the ground is happening in the plants on top, and then the fire travels deep into the ground and can just pop up somewhere else where it's travelled under through the peat or through the roots of the trees and stuff, and it'll pop up somewhere else. So reignition is a big issue. So you do have to damp down the entire area. It takes a very long time.
Jim, can I start with something? I'm just making a point about the resources issue, because it will depend on the geography of where the actual incident is and how the fire service can tackle it. So if you take the example that was mentioned of Saddleworth Moor, Winter Hill, there they actually did run hose lines, but you think you're running hose lines literally for miles, and then firefighters will know this. Making up hose is an extremely physically demanding job. It's all very well getting out there, but normally I worked in London. We had a hydrant on every corner, and a couple of lengths of hose would get to a house. But when you're dealing with that over a huge area, then there is huge demands on people. It's very physically demanding on the people doing that job. And then even after the fire has eventually been put out, there's a huge task to tidy up all that equipment. So, and I would say one other thing I think that's it's an interesting question we need to explore in Scotland. Denise might have something to say. Is how, particularly the Westminster government, frankly, but we've heard a narrative for 20 years about the declining number of calls, and across the advanced economies, domestic fires, there has been a decline in domestic fires generally, although it's plateaued in the past 5 years in the UK. But what the Westminster government does is count a flood or wildfire as an incident. Well, you've just heard that the difference between an incident which is a bin fire on the streets of Glasgow and the incidents that have just been described to you today. And this is how statistics are then used against us to say, actually, this justifies reductions in funding and so on. So I think there's another debate about really what do these incidents mean, because they are so labour intensive and time intensive.
Maybe you were in, I don't know, the Scottish end of it, you mentioned earlier about the Scottish Government's framework. Is there any indication within that framework that it talks about that they are seriously going to increase resources to that police?
I mean, the government do recognise within the framework that this SFRS will require to be, resourced. They will require to respond to more extreme weather events. However, it's very, very light on the funding of that. It's very, very light on, who's going to pay for that and the resources, etc. So the point I'm making is there's an acknowledgement, which is great. Governments acknowledge that this is what public services need to do, but you need to follow that up with long-term investment funding. Not just a wishy-washy few £1 million here or a few £1 million there. And not just investment funding, making sure that the infrastructure is still going to stay in place. I spoke earlier on about the 356 fire stations. That's all very well. You need to make sure you've got fire appliances that's properly crewed with enough firefighters behind there You can have 356 fire stations with 150 of them lying empty, because that fire appliance has not got enough firefighters to crew. It's not just having firefighters on it, it's also to have safe crewing levels as well. Very, very arduous job going out there for days and weeks on end, responding to these incidents. We need to make sure that we look after these firefighters and we have enough resources in place to do that.
Was there a question in the second row there?
Yeah, thank you. It's not a question, it's really an observation. I mean, in London, the highest number of incidences were made recently on the 12th of July. And it wasn't fires, it was floods, in response to flash floods in particular locations. And it certainly, to me, makes me think that actually the pumps in the back of the appliances are probably more visible and will be more visible than anything else. Thankfully, there are fair number of those in the Paddington fire station, to me. And it just made me wonder, we may come to a time where we may have to call the Fire Brigades Union, the Fire and Flooding Brigades Union. That was just a flash flood. We're not going to get any major infrastructure like we did in the Thames Parallel. So we're going to have the investments that Matt was talking about. We're still in the better. I just thought to hear the perspective of Scotland we've had in London.
Yeah, I think the point you raised there about the pumps is really valid, because, again, my own experience, turning up on my street and speaking to my neighbours who were desperate for the fire service to do something, to pump this water away. You've got pumps, pump the water away. Where? And that's the issue. That's the issue that people don't understand. Where do we put this water? We're everywhere around for 20 miles plus in flooding. And we've nowhere to put it. So it's simply a case of we need to wait for this to subside. And then if you've got flooding into your floors or flooding in your basements, then we'll do a bit of salvage work to pump it out. But the reality is, in those situations, we are so limited as to how we can protect people's properties. We have to focus on protecting life at that time and trying to make their property safe as far as electrics and gas. Again, the water pressure on the streets there was causing the gas mains to rupture. And we're having to tell residents, do not light anything, do not attempt to put your lights on, because there is currently a gas leak in the street that the gas board can't even fix because it's underwater. So it's this knock-on effect of all these things happening. And us again standing, feeling really helpless, and that's not what firefighters do. We turn up when we fix things. We turn up when we make it better. That's the whole purpose of us being there, and we can't. And all we can do is just give advice to people in these situations. So, yeah, the pump side of things is important, but under those circumstances, we're so restricted in ability to intervene.
Fiona Hislop's a member of the Scottish Parliament.
Hi, Fiona Hislop. I'm SNP member of the Scottish Parliament for the Lithgow constituency, which is half of West Lothian. Can I thank you for a very, very powerful presentation? And I think you've brought home the human aspect to this. Flooding is terrifying, and it's been anywhere near, both for the public, but clearly what it means to you as firefighters. And it strikes me that we need to tell the people side of this more, but we also have to, I suppose, bridge the fact that in fighting climate change, a lot of it's about numbers, whether it's trillions or 100 billion for mitigation globally. But I think we also need to translate that to the issues that are facing us, to try and again persuade those that we have to persuade with the resources that we need. So I wonder what work you're doing with academics that are working in the kind of land use for the fire, from the flooding and the incidents, to try and capture that in a way that is probably more in the climate change kind of lexicon and language, and particularly in terms of that impact. And I wondered about the Saddleworth Moor, where you were talking about peatland and the burning. Now, obviously, a lot of the attention has been about emissions and what's going up. Now, that must have had, that fire itself, in terms of what it contributed to global warming, in terms of that, will be measurable somehow. And I just wonder whether there's a role to be working with, like Nature Scott or whatever the equivalent is in England, in terms of making, actually put this into the numbers that we know that will also help in terms of the resources. And finally, I'll commit to take this back to the Scottish Parliament And I do think that we're looking at budgeting, we're looking at things, Deputy Committee, Net Zero Committee, we'll be looking at things across all areas. The Justice Committee, we'll need to look at what they're doing for climate change. I'm assuming in Westminster, there's probably, well, there should be some similar way of saying, well, what is your budget line doing, either for mitigation, which this is, but also for other areas. So I think it's given me a lot of food for thought. And I just wonder that, keep telling the human side of it, because it's really, really powerful, but there is an opportunity there to make a convincing argument in terms of the carbon aspect, and prevention, as we all know, is far better than cure. So how do we get this in preventative spend? So that's my question.
I think there's some really great points there, Fiona. I think, and there are big differences on many of these issues between different parts of the UK. One thing, and again, Denise might, or the Scottish member of the Scottish Fire Service may correct me. One of the problems we pointed out to some chief officers in England the other day is that there's quite a low level of awareness. When people see people turning out to floods and boats and dry suits, they don't actually know who they are, because many English fire services haven't actually branded them properly. So you see a boat and some person with a helmet and whatever. We need to be making sure that people know that actually these are firefighters doing this. Of the boats that respond to flooding across the UK, about 95% of them will come from a fire and rescue service. There are clearly then RNLI boats and stuff, but generally it's firefighters. I think on the research point again, and I'm making a sort of UK-wide point here, one of the problems, so we've done various reports on floods and climate change. We need to do more as a union, but one of the problems for the service is that generally research in the UK Fire and Rescue Service has almost been eliminated. There is very, very little research being done. You take on a different story, Grenfell, we used to have bodies that would be, if you like, horizon scanning about what risk is and how risk changes and stuff. There were warning signs about Grenfell, to be honest. We made those warnings as a union, and yet people have clearly ignored us, because a lot of the structures that were there in the 1960s and 70s and 80s have gone. So I think for us, there needs to be stuff that we can do as a union, but I think there's also stuff we can discuss with governments about what they need to do as well in some of this research.
Yeah, no, look, these events are great, but they're even better, I think, we're hearing from members of our Parliament, plus party members of our Parliament that are here. So the fact you've committed to take that back, Fiona, that's really appreciative. And I completely agree with you about the human side. Politicians, because believe it or not, they're the ones in power and they're the ones that can change things. They expect people like myself or the General Secretaries or people leading unions throughout the UK. But what's really, really important is to hear from the frontline firefighters whose experiences of talking about getting phone calls from family members when they're in the same time in the back of a fire engine responding to incidents. The amount of times control operators are doing, firefighters in control are giving life-saving emergency information out. This is the stuff that people need to hear. I don't want people to hear from myself, my General Secretary. If we really want to break through that narrative, it's a frontline response that we need to hear. And welcome your comments about the Justice Committee. I think the Scottish Parliament should absolutely, various committees, be having opportunities for the workers' voices to be heard. So let's have briefing sessions for the Justice Committee, for the rural committees, for the social committees, etc. within the Parliament. And let's not it be from people like myself or other leaders within the trade union movement in Scotland. Let the frontline people, whether it's the NHS healthcare workers or the fire service or people within education. So we need to have these parliaments be more accessible to the working class people, I'm talking within Scotland, the public sector workers within Scotland, because sometimes I'm sick of hearing my own voice. So parliamentarians will be sick as well, but I'll tell you what's really impressive is contributions from people that probably aren't used to speaking here today, and for me, I want to put, place my record of thanks to, everybody here that's came up and spoke in front of, a crowd here that's obviously a live stream as well. I don't think we told you it's a live stream. You maybe been a wee bit nervous, but it's a live stream as well. But for us in the FBU, this is the nuts and bolts of what we do. These are the people on the front line responding to this. So thanks very much for your contribution there. We will absolutely be following that up as well. Thank you.
Expect a visit.
Just picking up on what you said about research in terms of stuff like that, my background is science, and actually something I know there are statistics out there you can look into how much carbon emissions will be from burning a certain amount of wood or whatever it happens to be. And actually that side of it would be definitely something I'd be interested in looking into, actually finding out how much 20 square miles of woodland being destroyed actually puts carbon into the atmosphere. So I really find that quite interesting, because actually then you can relate it to the comparable number of cars running or whatever it happens to be as an equivalent, so people can understand it. Because I know that from talking to friends and family and so on, they talk about 100 grams of carbon being released in the atmosphere. That doesn't really mean much to most people. But if they said that one incident, there's 20 square miles is equivalent to 100,000 cars going up the M1 or whatever, that is that tangible sort of side of it where people can understand actually what the impact of these things are. And by having a wildfire incident caused by global climate change, we're actually making climate change even worse by having these things happen and releasing that sort of stuff into the atmosphere. So I totally take that point on and really think that's something we could definitely look into.
Thanks, Bill. So we just have almost come to the end now, and I want to welcome our final speaker here really is Jeremy Corbyn, the MP, who's the founder of the Peace and Justice Project. Don't know if you want to come up, Jeremy, or I'll get from here for that.
Thank you. Could I just say a huge thank you to the Fire Brigades Union. What do you want me to use the microphone? Thanks. Could I just say a huge thank you to the Fire Brigades Union first of all, because this to me has been one of the most powerful presentations I've ever seen from the union. Thought out, intelligent, and totally backed up by facts and by brilliant people that work in the fire and rescue service, and showing us just what the effects of global warming, climate change, and all that is to all of us. And the way you had to deal with calls from people desperate to be helped in floods in London, hundreds of miles away. You wouldn't necessarily know the area they're from. You'd have to do your best on it. And obviously that integration of the service is so very, very important. But what it also shows, all of this, is the lack of serious planning for climate change across the whole of the UK. Because the floods have been coming more and more. The moorland fires have been coming more and more. The global warming is there. I've got here a copy of the New Scientist, published in April of this year. And it's, the New Scientist often does very good stuff. And it just gives a very good summary of the effects on the whole world of what's happening with climate change and what the effects are in this country. Put yourselves in a position now, say 40 years from now, 30 to 40 years from now. Are we going to do nothing about it, or accept that large areas of East Anglia in England will be underwater? Quite a bit of central Scotland will be underwater. Quite a lot of the Somerset levels, if not all of them, in the West Country will be underwater. And the Thames barrier will be a thing of the past, but it simply won't be able to cope. You're going to have to build something much, much bigger. And you're going to have to do an awful lot more planning on upland tree planting in order to reduce flooding, floodplains, and a whole lot of other things. And that integrated planning, I don't believe, is sufficiently happening. And I simply don't trust the ability of the government to do this. I remember having a meeting with Matt during the beginnings of the COVID crisis, because I asked him for some information and some briefing on his emergency. And you were telling me, and this was, I was about to go to a meeting with the Prime Minister and others about how we deal with the COVID crisis. And I was speaking to Matt about it. And he was saying that in, I think it was 2008, he was at a very high level meeting with the government about future dangers, one of which was unknown virus appearing, which becomes a global pandemic. Where was the storage of PPE equipment? Where was the research into the problems about this? Where was the investment in health services, preventative health services, not just in this country, but all around the world? We're an integrated world. We have to be prepared to look after each other. And so, first of all, it's funding for the fire and rescue service. Secondly, it is more training and it is more research that's done so that they can cope with the extremes of the issues. And for all of us, it is reducing carbon emissions, it is reducing pollution, it is about not burning fossil fuels, and above all, it's about not threatening those that work in currently polluting industries, but instead offering them a way out of it, a green industrial revolution where we support the people working in those industries in order to transform them into doing something that is less polluting and less damaging to our environment. Let's not have a repeat of the destruction of the coal industry all those years ago, which just left ghost towns and misery behind. Instead, public investment to get us through this. A free enterprise system won't cut it. It's got to be something a bit more sensible and a bit more advanced than that. I'm personally not totally hopeful about what's going to come out of COP. When I see the numbers of lobbyists there from the fossil fuel industries, that kind of worries me. But I am excited by the way in which people all over the world are waking up to protecting biodiversity, reducing the number of emissions, preventing temperature rise beyond 1.5 degrees C. I think the effect of that politically around the world will be very important. And I conclude with just saying an enormous thank you to the Fire Brigades Union and all of its members, not just for keeping us all safe all the time, but for raising often very difficult questions of public concern and ensuring that people in political office are forced to listen to them and take it on board and do something about it. Thank you, FBU.
Thanks to Jeremy, thanks to Peace and Justice Project, to the Fire Brigade Union for doing this, and to Matt, Denise, Will, Colin and Roddy. Thank you. Thanks for coming along.